We're going to be diving right into this panel, and I literally could not have thought of a better introduction to this panel than Professor Nitahane's presentation. And there's some familiar faces here. When we invite people down, like Ken Anderson, they have to sing for their supper repeatedly, and but I think he has no introduction required. There are two people new to the panel, new to the conference today, and I'm sure Ken will do the introductions, but Dr. Missy, or Professor, which do you like better? Dr. Mrs., Miss, whatever. The lady at the end has been a very good friend here at Duke, and it just shows the university writ large, because although a former F-18 pilot, and by the way, we have some E-model F-15 people in the room, and she is the foremost authority on the engineering side of autonomous weapons, drones, and everything else. But I did want to mention Mike Newton, just one literally war story. We went to Iraq a couple of years ago, and because I'd been invited to be part of this team that was going to train Iraqi judges and defense counsel and everything, and I was really impressed with myself. I thought, you know, they finally recognized my expertise, and so I went there, and it was done with DOJ. DOJ had some kind of role in it, and I said, well, you know, I'm going to make this presentation. DOJ guy goes, look, General, I don't care what you say. The only reason you were invited is we had to make sure the Iraqis would show up, so we needed a general there. We're really counting on Newton to carry the water here. That is a true story. Okay. Ken.
Let me just ask one question. What time are we winding up here?
11 o'clock.
Okay.
And we will stay on time on target for that.
All right. I am not going to say very much more than what's said here, but I do have to say that this is an absolutely stellar panel, and if you are not acquainted with this issue, just be aware that it would be hard to come up with a better group of folks than are sitting up here now. And this is an area in which there's lots and lots and lots of misperceptions, most of them arising out of movies. Right? So I guess I'd say that all of us who are not actually technologists, and by the way, Dr. Cummings is now full professor in the School of Engineering, Professor Cummings, and for those of us who are in the law field, we tend to hand out full professor kind of like candy to children. It doesn't take that long, and it's just kind of normal. It's taken me a while to figure out that in other parts of the university it's not quite as the same. So for those of us who don't come from a technology background, it's just the case that anything that has the word robot in it tends to cause us all to wind up thinking about all the movies we saw. This is true even, I found, of a number of the engineers. Years ago, I was at an engineering conference talking as a lawyer about emerging technologies and the rest, and somebody raised their hand and said the inevitable thing, well, it's okay, we just have to be sure that all of these robots are programmed with the Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And I paused for a second and said, okay, so how many people here are familiar with Asimov's 3 laws of robotics? Okay, so all hands go up. In the engineering conference, I said, how many people can recite them from memory along with me? And we proceeded to recite them. So the sci-fi, the movie, the Terminator, especially when it comes to weapons, for those of us who are not embedded in the technology, I would say pretty much all of us have gone through that phase. But the real questions arise once you push past the sci-fi and start asking what the technology actually looks like and what it's capable of doing and where it's headed if you stay within the frame of the short to medium term, the foreseeable path of a given technology, rather than starting out that way and then suddenly jumping to something that's just purely speculative, purely imaginative, purely looking into ideas that would require entire new principles of technology, kind of like the Star Trek transporter beam, right? I can imagine it, but it's not going to be happening anytime soon, and it's not an appropriate subject for regulation. And I guess the last thing I would say by way of introduction is I gradually come to think that a way to evaluate new robotic technologies where the metaphors drive us so much of the time is really to ask ourselves about some piece of new robotic technology, especially in the weapons space. Do we think fundamentally, deep in our hearts, that the problem with the technology that we need to be on the lookout for is that it's too smart, right? Terminator smart, Skynet smart, sci-fi smart? Or do we think that the real problem with the technology is that it's likely to be too stupid, right, for things that we're actually trying to engineer it for? And that we need to sort of always keep those background assumptions in mind in an area that tends to be as kind of metaphor-driven and image-driven as this area is. Now, we're going to proceed in the following order. I'm going to ask Dr. Cummings to start out and both to sort of tell us what she thinks ought to be going on in this area, but also to take a little more time and to fill in kind of the background about the technology so that we're kind of all on the same page with regards to what we're actually talking about. And then second, turn to Mike Schmitt and ask him also, again, to express his views about law, regulation, this sort of stuff, but in doing so to take a little extra time and kind of lay out the broader structure in the law of war about weapons regulation and the law of weapons. And then turn to Mike Newton and ask him to address certain areas of kind of the moral issues that go beyond, in some ways, the strictly legal issues. And then finally turn to Rob, who has had a long, distinguished career in the U.S. military as a lawyer, but is now in a very special and I think quite unique position with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which of course has such a crucial historical role running right up to today in terms of the kind of guardian or conservator or trustee, if you like, of the law of war via the Geneva Conventions. And Rob, I'll leave it to your judgment given the fact that you're constrained by organizational things. Okay, and Missy, it's all yours.
Okay, all right. So I'm just going to give you some history here. You heard that I was an F-18 pilot. It's true. I flew A-4s and F-18s, and I was one of the first fighter pilots, female fighter pilots for the United States, and that's a long time ago. And then I worked at MIT for 10 years, and then Duke successfully wooed me down here, which just goes to show you I am a mercenary. So I have a long history of both military operations and technology. Next slide, please. Okay, and if you just want to give me that, I'll take it. So there's a lot of confusion about the word autonomy. You hear it a lot, but there's actually a very distinct meaning to autonomy as opposed to automatic. So I've put some rules up here for you. The Predator drone, unmanned aerial vehicle, is an automated vehicle. It operates by a very clear set of controls, fly-by-wire. We've had this technology around since the 1970s. It doesn't do anything that an operator doesn't tell it to do. The X-47, which I would say down here, it was the Navy's most cutting-edge unmanned aerial vehicle, recently cut just a couple of weeks ago, and that's an issue that we're going to circle back around to. I would say this would be more of an autonomous system, and why is that? That is because we jumped from a pre-programmed vehicle into an autonomous system which basically has the ability to start reasoning by itself. The Predator doesn't do anything that somebody's not telling it to do. Theoretically, the X-47 could be told to go on a mission, find the bad guy, kill the bad guy, and I don't want to hear from you again until you come back. That would be an autonomous system. But the reality is we're still in the United States and all other governments in the military, and we're going to come back to that because that's probably not going to be true very long in the commercial world. The military drones are still operating in automated modes. It is a substantial engineering leap to go into autonomous modes because you have to go from something called deterministic reasoning to stochastic reasoning. You as humans are stochastic reasoners. You basically move through your day guessing about the world, guessing about how your actions may or may not lead to certain consequences. And your success as a person is how good of a guess you make about the choices in your life. So we're going to talk more and more about it is the need for autonomous systems to be guessing machines is what causes them to be problematic in terms of technology development. I also want to make the distinction between autonomous systems and autonomous weapons. Right? This something gets convoluted quite a bit. People think of drone and they think killer robot. The drone is actually a very simple automated aircraft, very simple. The engineering challenges to build drones are very low. But we get confused with, well, what if we put a weapon on there? Is the weapon autonomous because we think the drone is autonomous? Weapons have their own reasoning capability, and they can be fired from anything, a plane, a drone, a manned plane, unmanned, ship, ground vehicle like a tank. So we need to be clear that there's reasoning on board platforms, the planes, but there's also reasoning on board the weapons too, and these things can actually be independent of one another. And that gets to the last but not least issue is, where is the human? In the predator operations, the human is very much in the loop. These are basically teleoperated vehicles that are operated with a human supervising them constantly. As we start to move towards autonomous weapons, and this is going to be true for your car as well, which will be theoretically autonomous one day, you are basically moved further and further off the control loop. And theoretically, in a fully autonomous system, other than giving a vehicle a goal, then you're out of the control loop. Next slide, I got it. All right, so let's talk about, I like to give you some framework so you understand the past, the present, and the future. This is the Tomahawk missile. Tomahawk missile, automated, autonomous. You didn't know there was going to be a quiz here this morning. Actually, it's kind of autonomous, right? I mean, it actually, there's a continuum, right? It's not one or the other. There's a lot of automation on board, but the Tomahawk, really early autonomous system where we take these digitized maps, put them in the maps of the Tomahawk brain, and then as the Tomahawk missile flies over, it actually takes pictures of the ground over it and says, here's where I am. Let me call up my map. How does that compare to the map in my head? Where I am? My brain. Where I am? My brain. Google Car works just like this, right? So in fact, this idea that we actually take pictures of the world and match them to a database, that's what happens in your head, right? So we've actually had some early autonomy around for a long time. And in fact, that's it, firing off a ship and a submarine. So a very, very good weapon, very expensive though. Oops, let me see what happened. Oh, it's going the other way. Okay. Now, the present. Well, Tomahawk's kind of present, but because it's so expensive, it's not used as often as we probably would like. We talked about the Predator. That's a phalanx automated gun. It's an automated gun. It's automated. There's a very little guessing going on. It's basically got some radar, some thresholds. A target comes in front of it, boom, it just blows it out of the sky, right? So we've had that for a long time, too. And in fact, it's making a leap from the Navy to the Army now because it's been such a good system. Down here on your lower right, this is it's a little UGV, ground robot, and the company who made it is Exponent, and they gave me this picture because they wanted me to send out the message about where we are in terms of the state of technology. It is a little ground robot with 2 twin-barreled shotguns. This is a killing machine. It was designed to basically have an autonomous mode where it would go into a village and find the bad guy and then blow away the bad guy all on its own. It went into the field. This was several years ago. The Army soldiers did not trust it. They turned off the automated killing machine component. And then they sent it into a village, and they could see on their ground control station that it was stuck, and they couldn't figure out why it was stuck, so they eventually followed up, and this is what they found. Soldiers come across a robot, surrounded by children. We can only imagine, had they left it in its automated killing machine mode, which I can assure you doesn't work at all, what this would have looked like on CNN. In fact, a similar case did happen actually in South Africa. It didn't happen to children, thankfully. It was at a military expedition where a similar system, a much bigger robot, ground robot, was at a demonstration with military brass, was set to fire on some target, and it turned around and fired onto the crowd accidentally, killed a lot of people. Well, that pays not to be a general then and be asked to come to these things. All right, so what about the future? So we talked about the X-47. What's funny to me is the X-47, you could argue that it was the Navy's and maybe even the military's most advanced killer drone. It's now been canceled. And the military, the Navy especially, they're shifting their resources into basically autonomous tankers, which I completely support. I think it's a great application. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be an either-or, because by the Navy dropping these programs, the Navy reduces its expertise in this area, and I have been very vocal in a mean way to the Department of Defense that they have lost their cutting edge. They have lost the ability to engineer these systems, and by canceling these kinds of programs, I mean, it's only setting the military further behind. Why do we care? Well, because commercial technology like Google Car, and I use Google, but it's really all driverless cars. They use the same technology, the same sensors, the same cameras, the same LiDARs, the same probabilistic reasoning under the hood. And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a huge commercial growth in these capabilities, and the military continues to fall further behind. And when we fall further behind, then the question is, when our competitors, which would be other countries, China, for example, gets these capabilities, and they will, there's no question about that, where are we going to be? How far behind are we going to be? Because we have a Department of Defense that values hardware development, not software development, and they don't see the value in pushing these systems ahead. Now, the one caveat is DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, who has designed this humanoid robot behind me to save your life. Yes, doesn't that look like a life-saving robot? It's designed to go into a search and rescue scenario, and if you're pinned under a tree or something, it's going to theoretically come and save your life. That's what DARPA says. I mean, they might admit that there might be military applications to this. Maybe, but really it's for saving people's lives. And I give this talk all over the world, and every single person who sees this says, I'm going to run for my life. And if I see this thing coming. And the good news is that as long as you can outrun that cord that you see laying behind it, you're good. Because there are some serious technological problems with these systems. Humanoid robots, the power is the number one problem. That's why it's plugged in all the time, because they can't power this thing. It actually does a really terrible job standing on its own. The proprioception, your ability to know where your body and limbs are in space and time, this is actually still magical thinking for robots. They're still really struggling to get this down. And these are basic elements as opposed to the ability, DARPA will say, well, maybe this is going to be a checkpoint guard that's going to stop Afghanis, for example, and have a conversation with them and then know whether they're good people or bad people. DARPA really needs to maybe paint it pink. I don't know. We got to soften this thing because, there's just so many problems when you start to think about the technology and where we're going with this. In my lifetime, we will not see Atlas, which is the name of this robot, become into any part of everyday life. All right, so it's a thorny path ahead. The thorny path ahead is, I would say, the number one problem with robots. We call it the perception showstopper. The ability for a robot to see the world around it and make inferences about what it is seeing and how it's going to interact in the world, whether that is Atlas trying to interview the Afghan at the checkpoint, whether it is that Osama bin Laden in that compound, Is that the Chinese embassy? These are actually still very difficult questions that technology struggles to answer today. And until we get the perception problem solved, by the way, that's also a problem for Google cars and other driverless cars, then that's going to be an inherent obstacle to moving these technologies forward. That's not to say that people won't. And I actually think the thing that worries me is not that the U.S. is charging ahead, because clearly we're not. We're canceling programs. The Air Force does everything it can to put drones in the garbage can. Sorry. But we all know that here, right? And so, and the U.S. is the only country that's put out a clear statement, which is the DoD 3000.09, which says that we will not allow robots to make decisions to kill, except there is a caveat. There's a chain of command of 4 people that can agree whether or not if there's an imminent need. My concern about that is I have met about 3 people in the United States government that actually understand the difference between an autonomous system and an automated system. And because we're canceling programs, we continue to lose our expertise in this area. And I'm not sure the military has people inside of it that it can trust to give them a technologically informed answer. Forget policy, right? Let's just talk about what are the odds that this thing is really going to work and not go into a village and kill children? Can you tell me that? I don't think we have those people. And we certainly don't have the people to do supervision and test and evaluation, again, because we're wiping out our technology, our future technology development in this area. And I step back and I say, I know I sound like I'm really beating on that drum. It is the same as if we decided to cancel the entire submarine development program in our country. This country's not going to do it. We're not going to stop developing submarines, even though we don't really need them all that much in today's climate. But the U.S. government doesn't stop technology development because they want to have the ability to ramp it up if they need to in some kind of wartime. But so we are gutting our UAV drone autonomous systems programs, and because of the emerging commercial market, aka Amazon and Uber and Google and you name them, what's going to happen is we're going to have the commercial world is going to outpace the military so quickly that the military will not be able to recover. And why do you care about that? Because it's the commercial marketplace. Google, we can discuss whether export control and ITAR is going to protect us. We're not the only game in town. Other countries know how to develop the systems too, and we are quickly going to lose our ability to stay in the race because we've got other companies who are developing and selling to other countries. One last, and I've put this link, man versus machine or man plus machine. It's basically the article that I wrote that tells you how you know if you're about to lose your job. You can go get it on my Duke website. So I'm working on a project right now with DARPA and a company called Aurora Flight Sciences. It is a project where we are making the second co-pilot in any 2-person plane into a robot. We call it the R2A2 project because we can't call it R2D2 because of copyright problems. But that's what it is. We're making a little R2D2. He's so cute and lovable. Into the right seat next to the pilot. And the idea is that I'm the pilot, and I'm like, hey, R2A2, can you take over while I go back in the back and get a cup of coffee? Something quite like that. So it's a very cutting-edge technology project. A couple of months ago, about a year ago, actually, we woke up on a Monday morning, we being the team, and as if the rapture had happened. The entire robotics team, which was based in Carnegie Mellon at the National Robotics Engineering Center, NREC, was gone. They were gone. They were just like empty chairs. Uber had bought them out completely over the weekend. What do we do? And that's what happened. Uber, getting ready for the Google car, the driverless car space race, which is what I call it, bought out every single roboticist in that group that we were working with. They were gone. That's not the first time that's happened. It actually happens quite a bit. Stanford routinely gets pilfered. MIT gets pilfered. Our top roboticists are being bought up by commercial companies to push those technologies ahead. Boston Dynamics, who was the best robotics company that the U.S. government had, they were not only they were the best, but the best by a long shot, was bought out by Google a couple of years ago. So I would tell you right now, the U.S. government, we're on the JV team for our roboticists who are working on our government projects. And if you don't think that's going to be a problem in the future, cite Missy Cummings, Feb 2016, I predicted that it was going to happen.
I'm just glad she doesn't have an opinion about it.
And I give up the floor.
All right, so I think we call this subtext. Right. Let's switch over to the regulatory and legal side. Mike, take it away.
So I'm going to walk around so I can see the screen a little bit. This is an unenviable position to be in. We heard about bio stuff this morning and knowing what you think, and now we've heard about robots, and now we're going to talk about Article 52, subparagraph 2 of Additional Protocol 1 of the 1977 Additional Protocol. So
Good for you.
let me talk a little bit about law. Forgive me if you're not a lawyer. I want to talk about how law, in particular the law of war, fits into autonomy. So this is the Department of Defense description. From a legal perspective, what we are worried about is two things. We're worried about the fact that the system, the autonomous weapons system, is going to select and engage a target based upon what we told it to do when we programmed it. And then we're going to be worried about the fact that while it's doing what we told it to do, if you will, there's no human intervention. So these are the legal issues that are raised by autonomy. Now, this is a hot topic in the legal arena. As you probably know, many of you know, there's a major campaign led by Jody Williams, a wonderful Nobel Prize winner, to stop killer robots. It's called the Stop Killer Robots. You can go on to stopkillerrobots.org. Lots of organizations are involved in the effort to ban autonomous weapons systems. In my view, that's, to some extent, that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Autonomous systems may be good, they may be bad. What we need to do is do a clear assessment of how it matches up to the law and see where it complies and not. For the lawyers in the audience, the parties that are part of the Conventional Weapons Convention, the CCW, they're looking at autonomous weapons. I'll be going to Geneva to talk to them next month. The Special Rapporteur, Chris Haynes, a South African, has done a wonderful report that he issued in 2013. The Icrc, Rob will probably talk about this, gathered a group of experts to look at it. The 2014 Icrc report is perhaps the best study of autonomous weapons in the law that's out there. You can find that online. And at the Naval War College at the Stockton Center, we've launched a project about 5 months ago to look at autonomous weapons. That will run for another 6 months. A group of active duty officers who are going out to the operators and talking to them about engagement philosophies and so forth. It was started kind of by Jeff Thurner, who's in the audience. He was in the Stockton Center some years ago, and he was the first person to really begin to look at autonomous weapons and the law. So let me look at autonomous weapons and the law. Apparently we have an autonomous clicker. So my view on this is that much of the stuff that I'm reading is way overcomplicated because they don't start with the basics. We're talking about an autonomous weapons system. What does an autonomous weapons system do? It engages a target. So what law is it subject to? It's subject to the law of targeting. And it's the same law that applies if you're a soldier with a rifle, if you're a fighter pilot, or if you're an autonomous weapons system. So let me remind the audience what those rules are. The first step, as I told you yesterday, the first step in any law of war analysis is to determine if you are at war. If you are, as a matter of law, in a state of armed conflict, and then if you are, whether you are engaged in an international armed conflict, state on state, or a non-international armed conflict, which is state and organized armed group versus organized armed group. Why? Because the law differs, because the laws are different. So step one in any targeting situation is, am I engaged in an armed conflict to which the law of war attaches, or am I at peacetime and I'm going to apply human rights law, which is very different and would create enormous problems with regard to autonomous systems. Second, am I shooting at a lawful military objective, a combatant, an object which is military in nature, military in use, and so forth? What law am I shooting at something I can shoot at? Third, am I shooting at it with a lawful weapon? Is the weapon system I'm using, am I allowed to use that system? Next, if I'm allowed to use a system, I'm shooting at a military objective, am I shooting at it in the right way? Are there legal limitations on how I may engage that particular target? Then I have to, as you know, take precautions to minimize any harm to civilians and civilian objects or other protected persons and objects. And finally, the last step in the process is I've done everything I can to minimize harm to protected persons and objects. Is it proportionate? Can I engage? So this is the law that applies, and what I'd like to do is go through this and show you where I think some of the fault lines are with regard to autonomous systems. I can make this clicker work. There we go. Let's start with what law applies. The law that applies in an international armed conflict, I think, has nothing to do with autonomy. When you determine, am I in an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict, and remember why you're determining that. Because you want to know what rules are going to apply to your engagement. If you're in a state-on-state conflict, in my view, the issue of autonomy is completely irrelevant. All you ask is forces from state A engaged with forces from state B. Very simple. Now, if we move from that to non-international armed conflict, remember, state against organized armed group or an organized armed group against an organized armed group, United States against ISIS, okay? If we're in that if we're asking whether we're in that type of conflict to which that body of law applies, now we may have a problem. Because for a conflict to qualify as a non-international armed conflict, you need two things. The first thing you need is a conflict hostilities that are intense. This is for the lawyers in the audience. This is, of course, the Tadich judgment from the ICTY. I don't think there's any problem with regard to intensity in terms of autonomy. Autonomy has nothing to do with intensity. Intensity is about how many bombs you drop, okay? But the second requirement for qualification of disturbances, violence has a non-international armed conflict is organization, okay? Now this may present a problem because if you are using autonomous weapons, those weapons are making the decision or are hunting for targets and then making the decision to engage those targets. And what that means is that you need less command and control of the battle space. Because if you're in a conventional fight, you have to have a lot of command and control, particularly if you're dealing with an organized armed group. But if your system is out there hunting, killing, then the amount of command and control you need is less. And so it may be more difficult as a matter of law to qualify as a sufficiently organized group. So you may have these systems creating a lot of violence, engaged in a lot of violence, but the group that is employing them as a matter of law is insufficiently organized, and therefore you're not in an armed conflict, and therefore what law applies? Peacetime law. Human rights law. So I see this as an issue we need to be thinking about in terms of autonomy. What's step two? Okay, I'm at war. Now I'm going to shoot at something. What can I shoot at? I can shoot at a military objective. Here is Article 52.2 of the Additional Protocol, which the United States recognizes as customary. It's a two-pronged test. Basically, the object has to, by its nature, like a tank, location, like a bridge or a mountain pass, purpose, which is the future use of something, the enemy intends to use it, or use, the enemy is using it, the enemy is in the church or in the steeple, using that as a lookout post. By nature, location, or purpose, it has to make a contribution to military action. I don't see any problem there. But remember, even though it by nature makes a contribution to military action, its destruction, capture, or neutralization, what? In the circumstances at the time, mean that it's going to give you a definite military advantage. The key here is in the circumstances at the time. And I think that may be problematic with regard to an autonomous system, because the circumstances at the time change radically. And so we have to ask ourselves, will the autonomous system be able to understand what is happening out there in the battle space over a period of time such that it can determine that at the moment it engages the target, that will give your side a definite military advantage. Now, some things will be clear and won't be problematic. If it's engaging military equipment like tanks or warships, this is always going to give you a definite military advantage. But what about purpose? How does, for example, if you've programmed the system to go after particular targets that the enemy intends to use in the future, and then the enemy changes its tactics, how do you, without a human on the loop, communicate with the system to tell the system that it no longer qualifies as a military objective? So I see some problems in that regard. There are a few other problems with regard to military objective, as we've heard yesterday briefly in a statement. You have to allow the enemy to surrender. If the enemy expresses an intent to surrender, then you have to accept that surrender if you can. How does a system do that? A system that's out there programmed. How will a system understand intent to surrender? And then in the early writings, Jeff and I wrote a few years back, we were kind of worried about doubt. How does a system resolve doubt? But I talked to some kind of smart people, and they said that in many cases, doubt can be resolved by requiring overlapping criteria for the engagement of a target. So it looks at the target, but before it engages the target, it needs to meet seven criteria. You know, it's emitting heat, for example. It's moving at a particular speed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So although we initially, Jeff and I, were concerned about doubt, I'm less concerned about doubt vis-a-vis military objectives. I'm more concerned today about the time factor. Okay. That's the military objective. The second requirement is, okay, I've got a military objective. Can I use a weapon on it? Is the weapon I'm using lawful? Well, there are a number, for the lawyers, forgive me, there are a number of criteria here that we all know. First, a weapon or a weapon system cannot cause unnecessary suffering to enemy combatants. This has nothing at all to do with autonomy. Autonomy is not relevant to this. This is about what's carried on the weapon system. The weapon that is carried on the system may in fact cause unnecessary suffering, but it's not about the fact that the system is autonomous. It's about the weapon. Now, second criteria is you have to have a system that can be aimed at a specific military objective and then otherwise comply with the targeting rules. So you have to be able to aim the weapon in the particular environment. When you're doing the assessment, I mean, people like Dick Jackson do this for a living. When you're doing the assessment of the weapon to determine the lawfulness per se of the weapon, you ask, what is the weapon intended to do? In what environment and in what manner? So here, I think there's usually no problem at all with regard to being able to aim at a specific military objective, because that depends more on the sensors, more on the weapon that's on board the system. It depends on the environment in which you're using that system. It's not an issue of autonomy. It's an issue of using a weapon in a particular, so it's not an issue of the lawfulness of the weapon. It's an issue of how you use the weapon. A rifle is a lawful weapon, but you may use it unlawfully, for example, by attacking civilians. And I think generally that's going to be the case here. Generally, with regard to this requirement, it's an issue of are you using it properly, not is the weapon lawful. However, I hasten to add that with regard to military advantage, I cautioned you on changing circumstances. As you'll see in a moment, that's also an issue with regard to proportionality. So if you have a weapon that can't cope with changing circumstances in the environment in which it's used or in the manner in which it's used, then that weapon would be unlawful per se and you could not field it at all. So for example, if you have a weapons system that's designed to loiter for long periods of time, and it can't understand on its own how circumstances may change, then that weapon is unlawful per se. So in the Navy, we're looking at systems that sit out at sea for long periods and look for enemy warships. This may be problematic. Depends on the system, of course. All right. Also, with regard to weapons that are unlawful per se, remember they can't have uncontrollable effects. It's the biological contagion. I infect you, you're an enemy combatant, but I can't control where the biological contagion is going because I assume you associate with civilians, okay? That's unlawful. Has nothing to do with autonomy. You don't need to worry about that. That has to do with the weapon on board the autonomous system. It's not about the fact the system operates alone. It's about what the weapon does, so you don't need to worry about that. And then finally, remember the underlying theme of weapons, the legality of weapons, the underlying theme is that if you're going to employ a weapon in the battle space, you have to be able to some extent control that weapon and predict the results. Okay? Now control, I don't mean man on the loop. You can control a weapon by programming it in a particular manner, but you have to always have some degree of control, whether that's a link or whether that's programming it in a certain way. And you have to be able to, before you put it into the environment, into the battle space, you have to have a sense of what that weapon's going to do. So as I talk to the wireheads that are doing this kind of stuff, the uber smart people, I don't understand anything they say, but what I'm kind of sort of getting from them is, wow, it becomes really, really, really complex at a certain point. And it becomes particularly complex if you're going to be talking about systems that learn. And so I would say autonomy is an issue there if it becomes so complex that the engineer cannot tell me what it's going to do. I believe that that's, with some degree of certainty, that will make the system unlawful based on the fact that it operates autonomously. Now, you have to shoot at a military objective. You have to shoot at it with a lawful weapon. Now you've got a lawful weapon and you're out there, you have to shoot at it in a lawful manner. You must use lawful tactics. What's the law on this? You may not intentionally attack civilians and civilian objects and other protected persons and objects. It has nothing to do with autonomy, okay? If you have a system that just goes out and kills humans, obviously, that's going to be unlawful. You cannot use it. You can't use a rock to attack a civilian. You will write that down. So you can't use any system to directly attack civilians, nor may you use any weapon system indiscriminately. So you have a system that is capable of distinguishing between, for example, combatants and civilians. It's capable of doing that, but you use it in a manner where it cannot. So you put it in the battle space and it's programmed just to kill everything. That's an indiscriminate use of a weapon that might be discriminate, for example, in a different environment. So you need to be careful about that, but that's a case-by-case analysis. When you've got your lawful weapon, you must be sensitive to the environment in which you're employing it. You must understand the capabilities of the system and how they will interact with that environment. So you may use it unlawfully, or you may use it lawfully, case by case. Now, there is a requirement in the additional protocol, which the Americans recognize as customary international law. There's a requirement that if you can engage targets in a civilian area individually, then you can't engage them as a group. In other words, no target area bombing, no carpet bombing, if it's okay to do that, unless you can engage targets independently. This, we don't have to worry with regard to autonomy. It's not an autonomy issue. It's what you're programming the system to do. So if you program the system to engage areas, and you could have programmed the system to engage individual targets within that area, then you've engaged in unlawful activity. Okay. You're at war. You got a good target. You're using a lawful weapon, and you're using it in a manner that is itself lawful. You now have an obligation to do whatever you can to minimize the harm from the lawful use of that lawful weapon to civilian objects, and other protected persons and objects. Now, this starts to get interesting with regard to autonomy, because you have a legal obligation, as the commander, as the operator, to exercise constant care to ensure you don't harm civilians and civilian objects. Constant care. And that's the problem, because that doesn't attach to the system. It attaches to the commander. It's the commander that bears that responsibility. So the question you must ask yourself is, I'm using this autonomous system. How do I exercise constant care over the engagement if it's operating autonomously? There may be cases where you can do that, where you put it in for short periods. It's a very discrete system. It goes after particular targets, maybe. But there will be situations where it will be difficult to maintain constant care because of the geographical reach of the system, because of the time it's out there, because of the lack of discrimination capabilities on the weapons that are on board the system, and so forth. So this may be a problem. Now, that requirement to exercise constant care is operationalized in a number of specific rules, one of which is you, the commander, the operator, the person in charge of the engagement, must do everything feasible to verify the target, to make sure that the target or targets you are engaging are, in fact, military objectives that it's lawful to engage. So this presents some problems. Again, if the system is out there, but you have other sensor information, okay? Because that's not the only system. It has onboard sensors that it's using, but you have other capabilities out there. Do you need to have a way to feed the information you're getting from those other systems into the autonomous system that's out there operating on its own? I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, but it is a question we need to think about, because the commander bears responsibility. The commander has information that may be relevant to a particular engagement, and he's got a system out there that's hunting and killing. Does that commander have an obligation? Must he have a way to get that information to the system? Now, we talked about this at the War College. We had a Brainiac session on this. And one of the bright people in the department said, no. And the reason is because in the precautions and attack requirement, what you must remember is it's subject to a condition of feasibility. And so this person in the department, she said, listen, it's not feasible. I'm a commander, and I've got information, but because the system's out there and it's operating autonomously, it's not feasible to get that information to the autonomous weapons system, and therefore, you get a get-out-of-jail-free card. I don't know if this is the right answer. I'm one of the big proponents of the feasibility issue. Everywhere I go, I tell people, chill out. It's about feasibility, okay? It's about reasonableness. However, in this case, I'm not so sure. And indeed, if you have a system that's out there that's not capable of getting information feeds from your other sensors or other sources, human or whatever, do you then have an obligation to use a system that is capable of getting all that information, like a manned system, okay? Or an unmanned vehicle that's being controlled by a human? Maybe you can't use it because the other systems can get that information in and use it to be more discriminate to avoid harm to civilians. Now, with regard to weapons choice, this requirement to take care to avoid harm to civilians also imposes a requirement on you that you use the weapon or weapon system least likely to cause harm to civilians in the attendant circumstances, so long as using the other weapon system will allow you to achieve what you were trying to do, your objective. So I've got several systems here. I have to pick the one least likely to cause harm. So Adam, I don't like him. I had dinner with him. It was extraordinarily boring. Okay, I want to take him out. He's in the military. He's a combatant, so I can get him. I can hit him with a rock, or I can drop a cluster munition on him. But all these civilians, I mean, Rita is from Human Rights First. Clearly, she's a civilian. Okay? I have to use the rock because I can accomplish my purpose with the rock, even though the cluster munition probably work pretty good, too, because I can't harm Rita. So there. You want me to speed up faster? Okay. So faster. We have okay. So I'm almost finished. Okay. So you have to choose the weapon least likely to harm. What we must be sensitive to is, in some cases, this means you can't use the autonomous system because you have something else available that will better enable you to avoid harm. So although you've got this cosmic all-weather system that's going to really dominate the battle space, if you could do so, for example, with manned aircraft, and those aircraft, because of the human in it, can better sense harm to civilian, then you must do so. Okay, I'm going to skip that because I'm going to talk about that right now. Finally, the last step is I've done everything I can to minimize harm, but now I've got to decide whether I engage or not. That's the point at which you assess the proportionality of the engagement. Now, proportionality, this is the rule, and what proportionality basically says is that the expected harm I'm going to cause to civilians and civilian objects and other protected persons and objects, if that's excessive to what I hope to gain from the engagement, then I cannot engage, okay? Now, I believe this is really problematic. This is the problem. Jeff identified it a long time ago. This is the problem with autonomous weapons. There were others, but this is the key one, because I believe we will be able to develop systems that will be able to assess collateral damage with sensors, okay? We have methodologies for doing that now. CDM is one of them, collateral damage estimate methodology. But we have ways that we can kind of assess what I'm going to do to that building, or am I killing people? Or we have ways to assess collateral damage. You can program the system to say, hey, if I don't know if that's a combatant or not, I will assume that it's not a combatant. I mean, you can do that sort of thing. There are problems with indirect effects. If you're engaging a target, and the target will have effects on other systems, like you're engaging electrical stuff, and that will reverberate through. If you're engaging computer systems, computer networks, and the effects will reverberate through, I don't know how the autonomous system is going to figure out what the reverberating effects are, the indirect effects, the knock-on effects, but generally, I don't think the collateral damage estimate is problematic. What I believe is problematic is the assessment of military advantage, because it's not about a tank is worth 2. It's about a tank is worth 2 now, okay? That's how proportionality works. And so how is that autonomous system going to understand the military advantage that accrues from shooting the tank? It probably will be able to do soon after it's launched, because the commander understood what was happening. But the longer they loiter and the further they go, the battle space changes. I mean, the battle space is constantly evolving. So the military advantage that accrues to an attacker from any particular attack today will be different tomorrow. Indeed, it may be different if we engage now. An hour from now, it may be different. The tank is attacking you. The tank is retreating. That makes different military advantage. And I believe that this is going to be the problem with autonomy. There will be ways that proportionality will allow you to do it. Sometimes proportionality is not an issue, so you're in the desert and you're just engaging military objectives for no civilians. Proportionality is not an issue. But I believe this is what we should be looking at. This is the United States Naval War College. Don't you wish you were there? Okay.
Thank you, Mike. And I think also those who deal in this area, you can just take that as an outline that can be used for many other things as well besides autonomy. Mike, the other Mike, Newton, please take the floor.
Big Mike, little Mike. Now we're into little Mike. You know, the crazy thing is that we all come to this with our human perspectives, and there is this normative undercurrent. So what I want to do is they asked me to sort of focus on the moral framework, the values framework. For me, it's like shining a flashlight into a dark closet. Just because we don't see the other things and we're focusing on them doesn't mean they're not there, right? So this is just a separate piece of the debate. And I kind of want to change the order of what I want to say. I want to pick up on what Mike was saying. It is a joy to be here with so many old friends, but I guess we're getting at the stage of our human experience where we say longtime friends. And the interesting thing, though, is that this framework of technical expertise and the technology and the legal developments, now what we're doing is we're extrapolating out and we're applying in whole new ways, whole new environments. So when we talk about proportionality, we're clear it's not just excessive, it's clearly excessive. But there's a relationship, there's a balancing that's going on there. There's a comparative analysis being made, and I want to pick up on Mike's point, sort of out of order of the way I planned this. He's exactly right, that it's not a static analysis. It is a shifting. It's contextual. So the way I say it, I just did a whole book on proportionality. And the way I say it, it's an objective test. We can program, and we could even envision artificial intelligence that makes that objective test. Here are the legal criteria. We will apply them objectively. But by definition, those criteria are being applied in a subjective way. Okay? And not only a subjective way, but it's not a static subjectivity. It's a shifting subjectivity. Okay? So there's the legal point, and Mike's exactly right. Now let me do what I was asked to do, Ken, which is tie it back to the values. Right? Jody Williams, as what she's really done is drawn on the Ottawa Landmines Convention campaign and tapped into this very powerful normative undercurrent. When we say killer robots, I mean, folks just are really comfortable with that phrase. Right? It's brilliant psychologically, because what it's tapping into is our normative bias. We want human beings who think, who have feelings. So if the idea is what really bothers us, that robots are cold, for me, that's a pretty simple technological approach, right? We program them to be warm. You get killed by a warm machine, not a cold machine. But that's not the problem. You see, there's a normative assumption that we're making as human beings. What we want is something that's fallible. We want something that has subjective judgments, that shows mercy, or responds to a shifting proportionality analysis, or accept a surrender. That's kind of the normative undercurrent that we come at this thing with. And just for the lawyers in the audience, particularly the young lawyers, or the younger lawyers, I think it's very important for us not to get lockstep regimented into this is the law and this is the mechanical application of the law. We've got to step back for a second, whether we're advising a commander or a client or even a corporation, and say to them, look, the law has a purpose, a fundamental underlying normative purpose. Okay, I like to quote Jeremy Waldron, particularly in the context of killer robots, right? Jeremy Waldron, who's himself paraphrasing Holy Scripture, says, lawyers should approach the law protecting human dignity with fear and trembling. He's right about that. So this is not, and that's the undercurrent that Jody Williams has tapped into, right? The lawyers just want to empower these killer robots, these cold automated machines that are completely out of control to do wrong things, and there's a very powerful normative undercurrent. What I would submit though is that that's divorced in some ways from the real underlying values. So let me give you just sort of three very quick sense of what the real normative values ought to be. This is just my opinion, okay? This is just Newton unplugged. But number one is this idea that there is this real tension between the teleology and the technology. The teleology being robots are bad, robots are cold. And the technology simply, for me, we've got it backwards in the debate. And I know Rob's going to talk about the Icrc and the whole movement out there to simply ban things. Wait a minute. Last time I checked, technology was developed by human beings to serve human needs, human interests. Implicit in that is the assumption that there's some normative value in what we're developing the technology to do. To say otherwise simply says it backwards, that we're the victims. You see, you feel a powerful normative thing. This is what Jody's trying to do, right? We're all the victims here. They're out of control. We have no control. And therefore, the logic, the values is, it's not serving our normative functions. Mike's exactly right. Lawful weapons being used in a lawful way to achieve lawful objectives, nobody's got a problem with that. You see, the undercurrent, though, is that we can't control it, that somehow we've gotten it backwards, and that's a very powerful, values-based, I call it the teleology of that. The problem is, what that implies is that we really are the helpless victims here, that we're just going to be captured by the technology, that it can't be controlled, and I fundamentally disagree with that. I say, wait a minute, let's step back like we do with every other normative value system. We've got law designed to serve particularized interests. So I just did an essay. Let's step back and say, okay, autonomous weapons are not this monolithic entity. Let's design them. Let's think about them in ways that they actually do serve the underlying normative framework. You know, and it's not that hard to do. You think, well, okay, if the normative framework is preserve human life, here's lots of ways we can develop autonomous weapons that actually are more discriminate, more focused. In that way, you might say, and superficially, more lawful. Why? But it's not just that they're lawful, you see. It's that we've tailored the technology to serve the normative end state. And this is what leads me to my second point. When I say law is not static, vitally important that we not forget what the law of armed conflict is all about. Mike's exactly right as a technical description of what the law is. But remember, the normative balancing that's going on is the very important, I've written about it, I just call it the non-negotiable necessity of mission accomplishment. It's not optional in a military setting, and that's what the law of war is designed to do. These rules don't exist in a vacuum. They're designed to create this holistic balance, and the moment that we begin to tilt one side of that, if you think of it conceptually, as a whiteout, the minute we begin to white out either side of that balance, we fundamentally changed the law of armed conflict, and in doing so, we've changed the normative undercurrent. This balance of mission accomplishment, which is another way of saying the proper zone of discretion, a proper zone of deference, what's reasonable under those circumstances? When is a warning possible? When circumstances permit? Okay? It's entirely possible 50 years from now, we could have the technology that helps us, or in some cases is empowered to make those decisions in its own right. But the second we say one of those two prongs takes precedence and cannot be accomplished absent the other, let's be clear what we've done. We have elevated one of those normative hierarchies to the position of dominance, and then we fundamentally changed the law of war. Now, that's always an option. But this is back to my teleology technology point. We've got, in my view, this is just Newton, to try to get on top of this, and it's disturbing to hear Missy say we're losing this in the U.S. government as a matter of U.S. government, because I say, look, let's take the best lawyers in the Western world and pair them with the best roboticists in the Western world and get ahead of this stuff to design it to serve our normative values, to serve our needs. Because I don't buy into the premise, just Newton, my opinion, that we're the helpless victims of this technology, that we just, no, let's drive it. But the key is let's drive it to serve our normative interests, okay, which is human dignity, which is undeniably mission accomplishment in a way that balances those things. And the law of war, Mike didn't say this, but he implied it, and I want to say it expressly. The law of armed conflict embeds that in a very carefully developed, very refined, very, very technically sophisticated way when you understand it. Don't listen to people. And in fact, when you do listen to them, because you have to, because they talk loud and they talk a lot, when you hear people who say that it's impossible to have this framework that carefully preserves those bounds, push back on that and say, no, no, no. Because if that's really true, then we absolutely are the helpless victims of technology. I don't buy that. I say, let's get ahead of that. Let's have a normative framework that moves the technology in a way that really does preserve those underlying normative values. Which leads me to my third thing. I wish I'd been here yesterday, sort of a nice intellectual loop back. Mike asked me, are you going to talk about accountability? I am, actually. Because one of the normative values that underlies all of this field is the sense that at some level there is a morally responsible human being who is making decisions. We may call them flawed decisions, we may call them imperfect decisions, and the law of armed conflict is designed to say, here's a normative framework that applies even in the midst of adrenaline and sleep deprivation and horrific human experience. Here's a normative framework that nevertheless guides your conduct at all times in all circumstances. To put it as a technical matter, under the law of armed conflict, as a morally responsible actor on the battlefield, you may never invent your own military necessity. Why? Because it's already embedded in the law. It's there, right? To the proper legally normative extent that we want it to be, the values of discretion, the values of judgment, it's all there. Therefore, as a normative matter, we say you can't make it up. So if a human being can't make it up, it logically follows that we don't want to empower the technology to artificially change that balance that's already embedded in the law of war. That's what Mike was saying, exactly, in values terms, okay? Now, let me give you two cautions. And this may sound like crazy talk, okay? A year ago, if somebody said Donald Trump would be in the league, we said, no, that's just crazy talk, right? Crazy talk. Don't even think about that. Crazy talk. Let me give you some crazy talk in this field based on a normative value framework. And here's what I'm doing. As much as I hate mathematics, this is a very simple mathematical formula, okay? Tie these two diverse fields together. Number one, the law of co-perpetratorship, okay? and it goes by various names, but essentially what I'm talking about, and I don't have time to give you all the details here, but the mode of responsibility for human beings that we've developed as a matter of criminal enforcement, okay? And if we say to ourselves, at some level, Mike's right, this undercurrent of Jody Williams' Ban Killer Robots campaign is we want some human being somewhere that we can point to as the morally, i.e. legally, responsible individual, okay? The law of co-perpetratorship, as it's currently being developed in forums around the world, it goes by different names, different structures, but it's pretty close at this point to strict liability. So put this in concrete terms. It means the programmer who 10 years ago, or the roboticist who 10 years ago made an error or did something intentionally for a different purpose, the law of co-perpetratorship can readily, in this day and age, and it's being stretched more and more and more. I date myself. How many folks remember Stretch Armstrong? Right? When we were kids, the whole goal was to try to break Stretch Armstrong. Right? It was a great victory to break Stretch Armstrong. The law of co-perpetratorship is getting us incrementally close there, and where we are today, you say, well, it's crazy talk, where we're pretty close to strict liability in legal terms. Now you say, well, why do we care? I'll tell you why we care. The second prong of crazy talk. We've made this big distinction, the panel yesterday made a big distinction, and here's where I want to tie right back into Mike's last slide, between human rights law and the law of armed conflict. Okay? Lots of distinctions we can make. The big evolution was that human rights law developed around a geographic model. We always said, in the ICCPR, for example, on your territory and subject to your jurisdiction. The geographic focus is built in logically because we want our government to be responsible for the human rights of those people who fall under proper governmental authority. No big deal there. Nothing controversial about that at all right? But over the last 20 years, what we've seen is, particularly in the European Court of Human Rights, this extension of that into various forms. So there's a lot of case law there I won't give you. I agree with most of that evolution because really all we're doing is saying, what's the proper scope of governmental authority? And the autonomous weapons system, translate that, what's the proper scope of human authority? When does a human being in that loop owe a moral, legal duty to those who are subject to that? Okay? Now, the main point is, under human rights law, we've evolved a geographic nexus over time. We've shifted it into occupation law, no big deal, right? Because the government in an occupation law setting functionally is the occupier, no problem there. Quasi-occupation, right? The Turkish cases in northern Iraq, not a big deal there because you functionally have displaced the government. There's always a geographic nexus. Then we evolve to a hybrid nexus. It's geographic because you're in a particular place, but you exercise control over this person or this group of people. Think detainees in Basra, even under the law of occupation, but that's still geographic, okay? Here's my caution to you. In Jalud, the latest, and I think of it as the end of the evolution in the human rights domain. And it happened in Al-Skyni too, although it was so subtle people missed it. 6 defendants in Al-Skyni in Basra, 5 of the 6, really no problem for me intellectually. The 6th, when the Brits send out an armed patrol, they're ambushed. They return fire. Now, who says under human rights law or the law of war you don't have the right to return fire in an ambush when you're being attacked? Anybody vote for that? No? And what body of law are we under? Law of armed conflict, fundamental human rights law, my right to defend myself. We're not talking about a geographic nexus. In Al-Skyni, the plaintiff who complained at the bar in the European Court of Human Rights was killed, tragedy, an Iraqi woman killed in the crossfire literally over dinner with her family. They can't even identify which side killed her in the crossfire. There's no forensics work. Result, full human rights accountability. In the language of the court, we've moved past the geographic nexus, the very fact of state action, the very fact that you left your secure compound in an occupation setting and went out on patrol carries with it the full panoply of human rights norms. Okay? In Al-Jalud, Dutch roadblock case under Iraqi control in Iraq, under Iraqi law, after the return of full sovereignty. Hello, what body of law applies? Human rights law through the Iraqi context. Okay? Ambush at the roadblock, fire is exchanged, the guy drives off within 5 minutes, another car returns, doesn't comply with warning shots. Hello, this is law of armed conflict. This is basic right of self-defense. okay? The Dutch Rapid Reaction Force uses deadly force, kills, turns out to be a mistake. This is why it matters. And this is where autonomous weapons get into trouble. Because the proportionality test is diametrically opposite of itself. Under the human rights proportionality test, only that degree of force that's strictly tailored, only what's absolutely necessary, only for the extent absolutely necessary, and the government bears the burden of proof. Obviously, very different under the law of armed conflict. So put those two things together. I mean, just be clear, and this is my last comment, Ken. Here's the theorem, okay? Just follow the theorem, all right? Under the law of co-perpetratorship, state action that gets to technology, and I could cite the Smith case for those who are here. Go back and read Smith as well in UK jurisprudence. This is how you make the leap. I think like crossing the shark. We've jumped the shark here. Okay? State action that affects technology gets you into essentially strict liability co-perpetratorship. Okay? State action that affects any other human being out there under Jalud fully implicates human rights law. Put those two things together. What it means is state action, any state in the world, to include the United States or the Russians or the Chinese, under that theorem that sends autonomous weapons out there remains strictly accountable for the effects of those things. And I just want to say to you, that's all well and good. Lawyers, go back to the normative framework. Go back to the real values that we're trying to preserve, because I'm telling you, the stream is moving in the opposite direction to have strict, bright line, big picture categories. And what I want to say to you, as literally the last thing I say, Ken, we can't let that happen because there's a fundamental immorality and illegality, if you want to put it in legal terms, to divorcing the technological developments from the normative framework that's supposed to guide how we do that. And folks, that's our responsibility as the lawyers and the policymakers. And if we abdicate that, well, then we really are, and I kind of agree with Joni. If we don't do that, then killer robots are bad, we ought to ban them all. But we can't do that practically, technically. So my point is, let's get ahead of it. Let's engage and stay engaged. And to quote Eleanor Roosevelt, courage is far more exhilarating than fear. Let's not be afraid of this stuff. Let's engage on it. Let's wade into it and make sure that it's informed by the proper normative sets of values. So there's a lot more to say, and Rob's going to say it.
Rob, carry us home.
Okay, carry us home. And I had hoped to leave time for questions, and I'll see if I can try and accomplish that as well as make a few points here.
Rob, I think you should go ahead and say what you're going to say.
Okay.
Don't worry about the questions. That's what we have a break for.
I am grateful to you, General, for the invitation. The ICRC has had an increasingly close relationship with you, and if I can take this opportunity to just thank General Dunlap for his ironic tone on a recent post he gave for our blog, our new blog, Intercross, in the Washington delegation. And my segue into a plug to many of you, any of you that are interested, particularly the students in the audience, we would love to consider original thoughts that you send us for contribution on that blog. And with your contribution, we would like to move into a kind of a point-counterpoint environment where we're willing to engage and take criticism of the organization as well as dish it back a little bit. One little bit of housekeeping from yesterday's conversation. Mike, you raised a few concerns about the ICRC's view about the geographic scope of the battlefield. I won't presume to defend the ICRC on the point. It's done very capably by colleagues of mine in Geneva who you know and have talked to. I'll just note that on the ICRC website there is a pretty significant report. It's just vernacularly known as the Challenges Report. It's developed every 4 years, and it basically charts the issues the ICRC sees coming as sort of a work plan for the coming 4 years. One of the issues identified is this notion of the geographic scope of the battlefield, and in that report, several pages are devoted to articulating the rationale that's previously appeared in articles in the International Review. Sorry, one more shameless plug. This is the ICRC's Law Review, if you will. Another plug for original contributions for any of you that may be thinking deep thoughts on the law of armed conflict and IHL. This is the one on new technologies in warfare. This is the hottest item in the Icrc inventory. If you have a copy or find a copy, don't let it go. These are hard to get a hold of. And we're lucky to get a few extra copies in the Washington delegation. Okay.
Online.
Yeah, it's available online. I'm talking about the bound copy. So anyway, the challenges report gets into some greater detail on that rationale for why the Icrc has found a territoriality component limiting status-based targeting, and expresses some concerns about, verbiage like global war on terror and global battlefield, and the idea that a single individual member of a non-state armed group or a representative of a state armed force could carry with him or herself around the world that NIAC. These are the kind of the animating concerns why the Icrc has attempted to adopt a legal framework. But like that, and like its view of autonomy, the Icrc is the first to acknowledge that these are positions that are subject to evolution and capable of change over time as experts like those at the table here continue dialoguing. The Icrc's position on autonomous weapons is informed largely by people like this at the table and some of you in the audience at the expert meetings. The 2014 report that Mike mentioned in his remarks was the first step. The Icrc has another experts meeting that will be convened in Geneva in 2 weeks with representatives of 18 different states, and that will also generate a report. So what I'll do in a few minutes with you is just reflect the Icrc's perception of the autonomy debate. You probably know enough, some of you might not, but the Icrc is a difficult institution to briefly describe. It's unique in the international community. It's really not an NGO because it has an international legal mandate to take certain activity and to promote certain things. And that mandate has been conferred upon it by member states of the Geneva Conventions. And every year at the quadrennial conference, that mandate is renewed and additional resolutions are adopted that give the Icrc additional lane to run in on this or that particular issue. So with respect to autonomous weapons, the challenges report outlines a number of concerns that most of which, frankly, Mike, you've addressed in your articulation, very capable articulation of international humanitarian law and where the fault lines and specific friction points might occur. One of the most difficult initial challenges is just identifying the appropriate terminology. And just in the span of the last hour and a half, I think we were kind of interacting as Missy was talking, and then Mike, as you were talking a little bit about normative frameworks. It's hard to get your arms around when you're using a term of art, such as semi-autonomous, as the term is used in DoD Directive 3000.9, or when you're just using a term that in the popular mind means something totally different. When we say autonomy to the common person on the street, I'm not sure we get to the same level of fidelity and precision that you get in DoD Directive 3000.9. And that's not a fault of the DoD directive or use of the term autonomy, but it's just a reality that when we're trying to get our arms around the right legal and ethical standards that apply, we have difficulty out of the gate even describing what it is we're attempting to regulate. The word, if my Jesuit training kicking in as I think of the etymology of a word, autonomy means self-law, autonomy. If you apply that idea to what we've called a fully autonomous or semi-autonomous device, I'm not even sure most of what we regard as fully autonomous is autonomous, because at the end of the day, you have millions of lines of programming code that somebody came up with that controls that device. Is that device operating according to a self-law that it has determined? You see what I'm saying? It's difficult to just capture what it is we're talking about. And when you overlay the debate with the elastic concepts of the UN Charter and some within IHL, some within the language of ethical theory, it really becomes difficult. So what the ICRC is after is controls and regulation on a specific kind of autonomy in weapon system. It's what it calls autonomy in the critical functions of a weapon. The ICRC views the critical functions as whatever those functions may be that control the selection of targets and the destruction of targets, or the targeting function of the weapon. Where we have an increase in autonomy in the critical functions of a weapon is where the ICRC is going to urge caution. Now, as I said, it's not a non-governmental organization and doesn't do advocacy in the traditional NGO sense of the term. The ICRC has not adopted a position calling for a ban on research or deployment or development of autonomous weaponry. We would be the first to acknowledge that there may be cases in which autonomous devices at the extreme end of the spectrum could save lives, could work to further the purposes of IHL. So it's difficult to call for a ban. But what the organization has done is urged extreme caution and gone so far as to actually articulate serious doubt that in some cases, in many cases, other than those narrow examples where you can limit anti-personnel collateral effects, where a fully autonomous device that does select and does engage targets all on its own without human intervention is going to be fully compliant with IHL. Largely for the reasons that Mike mentioned, I would highlight, foot stomp, shout from the highest mountaintop, the notion of military advantage as being the difficult, if any, acid test for whether an autonomous device is going to be compliant with IHL. And the notion appears not only in the doctrine of proportionality and the rule under AP1, Article 51, but it's there in the definition of military objective. Military advantage may be easier to handle there because you're not having to balance it against the other variables that you do.
Problematic.
But it's still problematic and very difficult to reconcile with the demand that the law places on deployment and use of a weapon under those circumstances. And I would also add that these aren't just a moment in time. You mentioned, Mike, that the proportionality calculation is not just, is that damage worth 2 tanks? Right. And is it relevant at a point other than right now? But these are micro decisions in the dynamic battle space, and when you throw cyber technology on top of it, where variables are changing at the speed of light, where a weapon must be able to independently, and if we're into the fully autonomous end of the spectrum, autonomously make decisions that take all these variables into account in a way that the law requires. This is why the ICRC expresses serious doubt that a weapon like that would be able to comply with legal obligations. But as I say, that's as far as the organization is willing to go, and the experts continue to talk, and our organization continues to listen and promote the ends of IHL. I couldn't agree with other Mike more that underlying principles and underlying normative frameworks have to be borne in mind as micro decisions and specific judgments are made. That would not only include the propriety, legal and ethical of weapons systems, but various claims that are made, particularly in terms of ethical claims. One thing that we have to keep in mind, I'm concerned about, is the promiscuous advancement of certain ethical claims as though they're self-evident. There has to be a measure of discipline imposed upon the basis on which you make certain ethical claims. And I'm not advocating one side or the other on the nature of the claim. I'm advocating for a disciplined methodology by which the claim is reached. And only then do you have the right to assert, for example, on the one extreme, that it could never be moral for an autonomous device to take a human life. That I would apply a strict process of analysis to a claim like that. but I would apply the same process of analysis to a claim on the other side as well. I see the tyranny of the clock in General Dunlap has arisen, so I'll leave my comments there, but I think you get our view.
All right, I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for doing this, and I apologize now that we actually don't have time for questions and comments to come up here, but frankly, I thought given the complexity of the topic that it was actually better spent time to actually have greater explanation about both the technology of the law and the ethics involved. So, Charlie, and thank you to all of you.
I'd like to foot stomp that. And I would like to say to Rob and the ICRC, the blog post that really says a lot of, obviously, if you read the blog post, I don't always agree with the ICRC,
No,
but
you
I think it says a lot about the organization and its dedication to the dialogue. Because I think one of the things that we've heard, especially from this panel, but I think in our whole conference, is that there are challenges emerging. And if we don't have this dialogue where we challenge different ideas, then we're never going to advance the ball. And I know lots of people have questions, but I'd rather have a conference where people, oh my God, I wish the panel was longer, because I've been at other conferences where it's, oh my God, when is this thing going to be over? But we are going to get back at 11:15, and really, what a fabulous panel. And one last thing, I do want to foot stomp. You saw Professor Farhani. You saw Professor Cummings. Duke is a pretty good place if you're on the engineering and biomedical science sort of thing. So tell your sons and daughters that this may be a good option. Thank you so much.